There is a moment when Ann Wilson is standing there, and she isn't singing. That almost feels wrong. For 50 years, silence was never what you associated with her. Ann was the woman who could walk into Crazy on You almost gently, almost conversationally, and then suddenly open that voice until it felt too large for the room. Barracuda was different, sharper, meaner, the kind of vocal that made you wonder how a human throat survived doing that night after night. And then in 2024, her body told her to stop, not slow down. Stop. Ann had undergone surgery after doctors discovered something cancerous. The operation was successful, but treatment wasn't finished. Chemotherapy followed. Later, Ann would reveal that radiation had been part of the ordeal too. Suddenly, Heart's tour dates disappeared. European performances were called off, and the woman who had spent most of her adult life walking toward microphones was being told to stay away from the stage. I keep thinking about that, not the announcement itself. We've all seen celebrity health statements. They appear on a screen. People share them for a day or two. Everyone writes, "Get well soon." Then life moves on. But the person doesn't. The person still has to wake up the next morning. Ann was 74 then. She had survived the 70s, the 80s, changing musical fashions, record executives, criticism about her body, arguments, breakups, reunions, all the strange machinery that surrounds a woman who becomes famous before she really understands what fame is going to demand from her. Cancer was different. You cannot outsing it. And maybe that is where this story really begins. Not with Heart becoming famous. Not with a record going platinum. Not even with Ann and Nancy Wilson becoming two of the rare women who could stand inside the overwhelmingly male world of hard rock and refuse to behave like decorative guests. It begins with Ann losing control. She had made a career out of control. Listen closely to those old recordings. She could hold something back until the exact second she wanted to release it. Power wasn't just about volume. It was restraint, timing. Then doctors were deciding the timing. Treatment was deciding the timing. Her body was deciding. When Ann publicly addressed her diagnosis in July 2024, she called what was happening merely a pause and insisted that she had much more to sing. It sounded defiant because, well, of course it did. This was Ann Wilson. But there was something underneath that statement that I'm not sure people noticed at the time. She also said she wanted it to be her last public statement about the matter. That tells you something. She wasn't turning illness into a performance. She wanted privacy. Imagine spending decades with strangers feeling that they know you because they know your voice. Then something frightening happens inside your own body, and suddenly millions of people want details. What kind of cancer? How serious? Will she sing again? Is this the end of Heart? Ann gave them almost none of it, and perhaps that silence frightened people more, because when somebody who has always seemed indestructible goes quiet, your mind fills in the missing pieces. Months passed. Chemotherapy, recovery, the waiting. Then in September 2024, another message came. The chemotherapy was finished. Ann said she was doing absolutely fine. The worst, she believed, was behind her. And still, something had changed. You could hear it in the way people spoke about her. They weren't asking whether Ann Wilson could still hit the notes. They were asking whether Ann Wilson would still be there. Those are two very different questions. And if you remember Heart when those songs were new, when Ann wasn't an icon yet, when she was simply this extraordinary young woman with dark hair and a voice nobody could ignore, seeing her now at 76 does something strange to you. Because suddenly, you're not only looking at Ann getting older, you're looking at your own years passing beside hers. And the strange part is, the most difficult chapter of her life may have revealed something about Ann Wilson that all those enormous notes never could. For years, people assumed Ann Wilson's hardest fight was becoming famous. It wasn't. Fame came quickly once people heard that voice. The harder fight was surviving what fame decided she was supposed to look like. Ann grew up painfully shy. She also struggled with a stutter, something almost impossible to imagine when you hear her sing. Because when Ann sang, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. The voice seemed freer than the person. By the mid-1970s, Heart had become impossible to ignore. Magic Man, Crazy on you. Then, Barracuda. Anne and her sister Nancy were women standing inside a hard rock world dominated by men, and they weren't standing quietly. They were taking over. But while audiences talked about Anne's voice, people inside the industry increasingly talked about her body, her weight, her clothes, how she appeared on camera. That pressure became even worse in the MTV era, when singers were suddenly expected not only to sound extraordinary, but to fit a very specific visual image. And Anne knew it. That's the painful part. Imagine walking on stage, opening your mouth and hearing thousands of people scream. Then walking backstage and hearing someone suggest that you need to change the way you look. Not your singing. You. Heart was still hugely successful. In the 1980s, the band exploded again with songs like What About Love for Never, These Dreams, and later Alone. From the outside, it looked like another victory. But success can hide uncomfortable things. Nancy was beside her through all of it. Younger, blonde, naturally fitting more easily into the visual mold television wanted. Neither sister created that comparison. The industry did. One was sometimes treated as the beauty, the other as the voice. And labels like that can quietly damage people. Anne later spoke openly about insecurity and about using food as a kind of emotional protection when she was younger. That detail changes the way you see those old photographs. Maybe what people criticized was partly armor. Armor against shyness, against judgment, against an industry that could adore her voice while making her feel uncomfortable in her own skin. And now, at 76, something feels different. The face has changed. The years are visible, of course they are, but after cancer treatment, chemotherapy, radiation, and decades of being told what a female rock star should look like, Anne still walks toward the microphone, and she doesn't seem to be asking anyone for permission anymore. Maybe that took longer than becoming famous ever did. There was another wound in Anne Wilson's life that had nothing to do with cancer, and in some ways it may have been harder to explain, because it involved Nancy. For decades, people looked at the Wilson sisters and saw something almost permanent. Two women who had grown up together, built Heart together, survived the music business together. Anne's voice, Nancy's guitar. Different personalities, different energies, but somehow the same story. Until they weren't. The rupture became public in 2016 after an incident involving Anne's husband, Dean Wetter, and Nancy's teenage sons backstage at a Heart concert near Seattle. It was ugly, not tabloid ugly, family ugly, the kind where everybody involved knows too much about everybody else. Wetter later pleaded guilty to assault charges connected to the confrontation. After that, Anne and Nancy continued fulfilling some professional obligations. But the relationship between them changed dramatically. You could feel it. Heart stopped feeling like a band problem. It felt like a family problem that happened to be standing on a stage. And that is much more difficult, because you can fire a manager, you can leave a record company, you can stop speaking to a musician. But what do you do when the person across from you is your sister? Nancy later described the period between them as painful. Anne too acknowledged that they needed distance. For a while they went their separate ways musically. Maybe that was necessary. Still, imagine what silence must have felt like after so many years. These were women who had shared hotel rooms, rehearsals, arguments, losses, success, exhaustion. They had watched each other become older, in a way very few people ever get to witness. Then suddenly, distance. And I think that part of Anne's story often gets rushed because people want the reunion. They want the sisters smiling again. They want Barracuda. They want the familiar ending. But real families don't repair themselves in 3 minutes. There are things you say that remain in the room long after the argument ends. There are loyalties, spouses, children, pride, memory. And sometimes love doesn't disappear at all. It just becomes difficult to reach. Years later, Anne and Nancy did find their way back toward Heart, not because everything that happened magically vanished, but because eventually they could stand beside one another again. That distinction matters. By 2024, the sisters were touring together once more when Anne's cancer diagnosis interrupted everything. And suddenly, all those older disagreements must have looked different. That happens, doesn't it? Something serious enters the room and arguments that once seemed enormous begin changing shape. Not disappearing, just changing. When your sister is going through chemotherapy, maybe the history between you is still there. But so is the little girl you grew up beside. So is the person who remembers your parents, your first songs, your first terrible gigs, the years before anyone knew your names. And perhaps that is why seeing Anne and Nancy together now carries more weight than it used to. They aren't simply two rock legends performing old songs. They are two sisters who discovered that even a bond lasting most of a lifetime can break. And somehow, they are still standing close enough to hear each other play. By the time Ann Wilson received the diagnosis, she had already survived almost everything the music business knew how to throw at a person. That is probably why the interruption felt so strange. Touring had always been movement: airport, hotel, soundcheck, stage, bus, another city. Then suddenly there were doctors, appointments, waiting rooms, the very un-rock and roll reality of sitting still while someone else explains what happens next. In 2024, Can revealed that doctors had found something cancerous and removed it surgically. She later explained that the treatment did not end there. Chemotherapy followed, and radiation became part of the process too. There is a detail about chemotherapy that Anne spoke about afterward that feels more revealing than any dramatic headline. She lost her hair. Now that might sound obvious. People know chemotherapy can do that. But knowing something and living through it are different things. Hair had been part of Ann Wilson's image for half a century. Those dark waves in the 70s, the enormous, unmistakable rock star hair of the 80s. Even as styles changed, there was always this visual presence surrounding that voice. Then one day the body changes the rules, and suddenly the person in the mirror doesn't quite match the person you remember. I wonder what that moment felt like for her. Not because hair is the most important part of cancer treatment, obviously it isn't, but because illness has a way of taking ordinary things and turning them into emotional landmarks. A shower, a brush, a shirt that fits differently, a face that looks tired even after sleeping. Small things. Things nobody applauds you for enduring. Han later joked about wigs and about the awkwardness of getting used to what treatment had done. That humor matters. Sometimes people imagine courage as something dramatic, almost cinematic. Usually it looks much smaller. You make a joke because the alternative is crying. You eat something even when you don't feel like it. You go back for the next appointment. That's it. And while this was happening, fans were waiting. Some probably wondered whether they would ever hear her sing live again. Anne herself did not speak publicly in great detail during the worst of it. She kept much of the experience private, which somehow makes the whole period feel more human. There was no carefully documented journey, no daily updates, mostly silence. Then in September 2024, she announced that chemotherapy was complete. She said she was doing well. Those words were reassuring, but there was something else in the message. Anne said the experience had been a lot. That's such an ordinary phrase. Maybe too ordinary for what she had just gone through. But people who survive difficult things often speak that way. Not because it wasn't frightening, because explaining the whole weight of it would take too long. Treatment ended, recovery began. And then came another question. Could she still do it? Not simply sing. Perform. Those are different things at 74 or 75 after cancer treatment. A concert does not care that you are recovering. The lights come on at the scheduled time. People have bought tickets. The band is ready. Your body either follows you onto that stage or it doesn't. When Anne eventually returned, there was no need for some grand speech. She walked out. That was enough. And if you watch her closely now, you may notice something that younger audiences probably won't. She isn't trying to recreate the woman she was in 1977. That woman is gone. She should be. Anne sings now with the years inside the voice. Sometimes the texture is rougher. Sometimes the physical effort is more visible. And strangely, that can make the performance more moving, not less. Because perfection isn't really the question anymore. Presence is. She is here, still singing after doctors entered the story. still standing beside Nancy after their family nearly fractured, still carrying songs written when some people in the audience were young enough to believe nobody ever grew old. And maybe that is why an older Ann Wilson can hit differently than the young one did. At 20-something, that voice sounded invincible. At 76, you know it isn't. She knows it too, which makes every time she opens her mouth and lets it out feel just a little more precious. Not like a farewell, something quieter than that. More like a woman testing the air again and realizing the song is still there. There is something strange about watching Ann Wilson sing now. Not sad exactly, just different. For years, people judged her by impossible standards. Could she still hit the notes? Could she still sound like the woman from 1977? Could she still make Alone rise the way it once did? But after cancer, those questions suddenly feel smaller, because the real question became much simpler. Would she come back at all? When Ann returned to performing, she did not return as if nothing had happened. You could see the years, you could sometimes hear them too, and maybe that is the point. A voice is not supposed to remain frozen for 50 years. It changes because the person changes. Ann had gone through surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, recovery, cancelled concerts, uncertainty. Then she stepped back into the place where everybody already had a memory of who she was supposed to be. That takes a particular kind of courage, not the loud kind, the quieter kind where you know people will compare you with your younger self, and you walk out anyway. Think about that for a second. Imagine being measured against photographs of yourself at 25 for the rest of your life. Every wrinkle becomes a headline. Every imperfect note becomes evidence. Every slower movement becomes a question. Is she okay? Can she still do it? Maybe Ann stopped caring about those questions a long time ago, or maybe she still hears them and simply chooses not to answer. That would feel more human. In 2026, when she spoke more openly about what treatment had been like, there was no attempt to turn herself into some perfect survivor figure. She talked about the reality of it, the physical changes, the treatment, the return, and she kept moving forward. That part matters, because survival stories are often told as if there is a single moment when everything becomes normal again. There usually isn't. You finish treatment, but your body remembers. You return to work, but you are not the same person who left. People congratulate you, and maybe part of you is still trying to understand what just happened. For Ann, the stage was waiting. So was Nancy. So were those songs. Crazy on You, Barracuda, Alone. Songs she had probably sung thousands of times. But after cancer, even an old lyric can sound different. Not because the words changed, because the person singing them did. And I think older fans understand that better than anyone. You can return to the same house, the same street, the same song from your youth, and still find that everything feels slightly unfamiliar. Because you changed. Ann Wilson is 76 now. She does not look like the young woman on the Dreamboat Annie cover. She doesn't sound exactly like her either. Why should she? What remains is something harder to photograph. The instinct, the phrasing. That moment when she closes her eyes before a note. The way Nancy still watches her sometimes from across the stage. Small things. And maybe those small things are why people still come. Not to pretend the years never happened. Maybe they come because the years did happen. Because Ann disappeared for a while. Because there was a real possibility that the stage might continue without her. And then one night, the lights came up again. She walked toward the microphone. Older, changed, still Ann. And for the people who had grown older beside her, that may have been enough. Ann Wilson is 76 now. That number means something different when you remember her at 25. You remember the dark hair, the restless energy, that impossible voice tearing through a room as if age was something that happened to other people. Then suddenly you look again, and half a century has passed. The strange thing is that Ann's story does not feel like a story about decline. Not really. It feels more like a story about shedding things, the pressure to look a certain way, the need to satisfy record executives, the idea that sisters never break apart, the illusion that talent somehow protects you from illness. Cancer took that last illusion away, and perhaps that is why seeing her now can be emotional in a way that has very little to do with nostalgia. She has nothing left to prove. 5 decades of records already did that. Heart's place in rock history is secure. Anne's voice is already part of the memory of millions of people. So when she sings now, the stakes are different. She isn't trying to become Ann Wilson. She already survived being Ann Wilson. That distinction matters. There were years when photographers made her feel inadequate, years when success itself became exhausting, years when the relationship with Nancy became painful enough that the stage they built together could no longer hold them. Then came surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, hair loss, recovery, and eventually, another microphone. I keep coming back to that microphone because nobody would have blamed her for walking away. She had already given enough, more than enough. But that apparently wasn't how Anne saw it. She returned, not because she could erase what happened, because she still had something to say. And perhaps if you have followed Heart since the 70s, you understand why that matters. You are not the same person who first heard Crazy on You either. Maybe you were driving somewhere. Maybe somebody you loved was sitting beside you. Maybe that person isn't here anymore. Songs collect people inside them. That is why hearing them decades later can hurt. Anne stands on stage carrying her own missing years, her own scars, while the audience carries theirs. For a few minutes those memories meet. That may be what remains after everything else disappears. Not youth, not perfection, recognition. Ann Wilson's story could easily be framed as the tragedy of what happened to her. But when you look at her now, another thought keeps getting in the way. She is still here, still complicated, still imperfect, still beside Nancy, still capable of opening her mouth and making an old room suddenly remember what it used to feel like. And someday there will be a final performance. There always is. But perhaps we don't need to decide which one it will be before it happens. For now the lights still come up. Anne still walks toward the microphone, and somewhere in that brief silence before the first note, 50 years are standing there with her.